Brace the Race, the podcast that explores issues related to race, diversity, and inclusion in Malaysia. I'm your host, Hanis, and today we're going to dive into the topic of racism. Now, before we get started, let's define what is racism. Racism is a belief that one race is superior than another, often leading to discrimination and unequal treatment. Racism can manifest in different ways, from explicit acts of violence to subtle forms of bias and prejudice. Unfortunately, racism is not a new phenomenon, and it exists all over the world, including in Malaysia, in our own country, Malaysia. While we have made significant progress in recent years, we still have a long way to go to eliminate racism from our society. But why is racism such a big deal? Well, for starters, it can cause harm to individuals and communities. Racism can lead to unequal treatment, lower life chances, and reduced opportunities. It can also cause emotional distress and psychological harm. Now, let's talk about racism in Malaysia. Malaysia, we all know Malaysia is a multicultural country with a diverse population of different races and ethnicities. However, despite the government's efforts to promote unity and diversity, racism still exists in various forms. One of the most common forms of racism in Malaysia is discrimination against the minority groups. This can manifest in various ways, such as job discrimination, unequal access to education, and unequal treatment in public services. Another form of racism in Malaysia is racial stereotyping. This is when people make assumptions about individuals based on their race, such as assuming that all Malays are lazy or that all Chinese are rich. We always hear that, right? And let's not forget about hate speech. Social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, they have become a breeding ground for hate speech and discriminatory behavior in Malaysia. This is concerning because it perpetuates negative stereotypes and can lead to further division and polarization. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are many Malaysians who are actively working to combat racism and promote diversity and inclusivity in our society. From grassroots organization to government initiatives, there are many ways that we can make all the difference. So, why? Why is it important to talk about racism in Malaysia? Because only by acknowledging its existence and working together, we can create a more equitable and society for all Malaysians. Welcome back to Brace the Race. In the last segment, we talked about what racism is and how it affects our society. Today, we have a special guest joining us. Nurul, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Nurul and I am excited to be here today to discuss the issue of race inequality in Malaysia.
Thank you so much, Nurul, for being here. As we mentioned earlier, we asked our audience to share their personal experiences of racism with us through a Google Form link, and we received a lot of stories. So today we want to take a moment to read some of them out loud. All right, so the first story we received is from Alia Maisara. She wrote, as a Malay Malaysian, I've witnessed many acts of racism against other races. One time, I overheard a Chinese shopkeeper telling his employee not to serve Indians because they are dirty and smelly. I was so disgusted by these comments and I made sure to never shop there again. It's important to stand up against racism even if you're not the target of it.
Wow, that's really disturbing to hear. I mean, it's sad to see that even within our own community, there are still people who hold such prejudiced views against others. It's heartening, though, to hear that you took a stand against it by boycotting the shop. I think it's important for all of us to speak up against such behavior and not let it go unchallenged.
Yes, Nurul, absolutely. It's also important to recognize that racism is not just something that affects one particular race or community. It affects all of us. And it's only by standing together and rejecting this harmful attitude that we can hope to create a more inclusive and respectful society.
This next story is from someone who prefers to remain anonymous. They wrote, I work in a company that is predominantly made up of Chinese employees. As a Malay person, I often feel excluded from important conversations and decisions. I have noticed that my Chinese colleagues tend to speak Mandarin with each other, even when I'm present in the room. I have also noticed that I'm often overlooked for promotions and opportunities, despite being qualified for them.
It is so disappointing to hear that someone would be treated like that in that workplace. It's important for companies to create a fair and inclusive working environment for all employees, regardless of their race or ethnicity.
Absolutely. And it's not just about diversity and inclusion being the right thing to do. It's also good for business. Studies have shown that diverse teams lead to better decision making and improved performance.
All right, so here's another story that was also sent by an anonymous. I'm an Indian and I was once on a public bus when a Malay woman got on and sat next to me. She immediately got up and moved to the back of the bus even though there were empty seats there. It was clear that she didn't want to sit next to an Indian person.
Wow, that's really unfortunate. It's disheartening to hear that people still have such discriminatory attitudes towards others based on their race. Next story is from an anonymous too. They wrote, I'm an Indian Malaysian and I have been discriminated against many times. One time, I was shopping at a mall when a security guard followed me around and accused me of stealing. I showed him my receipt and proved that I had not taken anything, but he still treated me like a criminal. It's unfair to be treated with suspicion just because of my skin color.
This story is deeply concerning and unfortunately it is not uncommon. It's it's unacceptable that someone should be treated as a criminal simply just because of their skin color. Discrimination against individuals based on their race is a serious problem that needs to be addressed. It's important that we educate ourselves and others to prevent these kinds of situations from happening in the future.
I agree, Hanis. It's disheartening to hear about racism and discrimination. We need an inclusive community where everyone is respected, regardless of their race or ethnicity. Education and awareness are crucial in combating racism, and it's up to all of us to take action.
All right, so the last story that we are going to share today is also from an anonymous. They wrote, I've experienced racism multiple times while studying in a local secondary school. I remember being bullied for my darker skin tone and my accent. People would mock my accent and make fun of the way I spoke. It was hurtful and made me feel like I didn't belong there. I tried to speak up to the teachers, but they brushed it off and said that it was just a harmless teasing.
That's really awful. It's not harmless teasing if it's hurting someone's feeling and making them feel like they don't belong. It's important for teachers to take this kind of behavior seriously and to create a safe and inclusive environment for all students. I hope that you were able to find support and solidarity with others who understand what you went through.
That's right, Nurul. Thank you to everyone who shared their stories with us. We hope that by sharing these experiences, we can create a safe space for people to speak out against racism and work towards a more equitable future. Well, that's all the time we have for this segment. Thank you again, Nurul, for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, please stay tuned for the next segment where we discuss racism in social media and the impact that it has on our society. Welcome back, everyone. So, we've been discussing some heavy topics related to race inequality in Malaysia with our guest, Nurul. Nurul, thank you so much for staying with us.
Thank you for having me, Hanis. It's been a great conversation so far.
All right, so now let's talk about something that affects almost all of us today: social media. We all know that it's a powerful tool that can be used for good or bad, right? But when it comes to race inequality, social media has often been a platform for hate speech and discrimination. Nurul, what's your take on this?
I completely agree, Hanis. It's very sad to see how social media has become a breeding ground for racism and bigotry. It's all too easy for people to hide behind anonymous accounts and spew hateful comments towards those who are different from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And the worst part is that these hurtful comments can reach a large audience and cause immense harm. It's important for all of us to be mindful of our actions on social media and call out any instances of racism or discrimination that we come across.
Definitely. One thing we all can do is to follow and support accounts that promote diversity and inclusivity. This will not only help to amplify the voices of those who are marginalized, but also help to spread awareness about race inequality.
That's a great point, Nurul. And it is also important to remember that social media can be a powerful tool for positive change. We can use our platforms to share our stories and experiences, educate others, and to promote empathy and understanding.
Exactly. And it's not just about what we post on social media, but also how we interact with others online. We need to be kind, respectful, and empathetic towards everyone, regardless of their race or background.
Yes, absolutely, Nurul. But unfortunately, not everyone follows this principle. In fact, social media has been notorious for spreading hate and misinformation about certain racial and ethnic groups. How do you think we can address this issue, Nurul?
It's a complex issue, Hanis, but one way we can address it is by working with social media platforms themselves. They have a responsibility to ensure that their platforms are safe and inclusive for all users. This includes developing better algorithms to detect and remove hate speech, increasing transparency about their moderation processes, and also collaborating with experts in the field of race and also social justice.
Yes, I agree. And as users, we also have a responsibility to report any instances of hate speech or discriminatory behavior that we come across on social media. It's important to hold people accountable for their actions and let them know that their behavior is unacceptable.
Absolutely, Hanis. And we can also engage in constructive dialogue with people who hold different views than us. It's not about attacking or shaming them, but rather trying to understand where they are coming from and educating them about the impact of their words and also actions.
That's a great point, Nurul. It's important to approach these conversations with an open mind and a willingness to listen and learn. And as we've seen from the stories that we shared earlier in the last segment, these conversations can make a real difference in people's lives.
Definitely. It's encouraging to see that there are still people out there who are willing to speak up against racism and discrimination. We need to continue to amplify their voices and promote a culture of inclusivity and also respect.
Well said, Nurul. Thank you for sharing your insights with us today. This has been a really enlightening conversation, and I hope that our listeners have learned a lot from it.
Thank you for having me, Hanis. It's been a pleasure.
All right, before we wrap up, I want to give you the opportunity to share any final thoughts or messages to our listeners about the issue of race inequality.
Oh, yes, sure, Hanis. I think the most important thing for all of us to remember is that race inequality is not just a problem that affects a particular group of people. It's a problem that affects all of us, regardless of our race and our background. We need to work together to create a more inclusive and equitable society where everyone has equal opportunities and is treated with respect and dignity.
Absolutely. And that starts with recognizing our own bias and taking steps to address them. It means having difficult conversations and actively listening to the experiences of others. And it also means that standing up against racism and discrimination both in our personal lives and on a larger scale.
Exactly, Hanis. And it's also important to remember that change takes time and effort. We can't expect to solve the problem of race inequality overnight, but we can make progress by taking small steps every day.
That's a great point, Nurul. And I think it's important to remember that we all have a role to play in this, whether it's through education ourselves, volunteering, or just simply being kind and respectful towards others. We can all make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think it's important for us to remember that we are all human beings with our own strengths and weaknesses, our own struggles and triumphs. When we see each other as individuals rather than as representatives of a particular race or group, we can begin to break down the barriers that divide us and work towards a more united and inclusive society, Hanis.
Well said, Nurul. Nurul, thank you again for joining us today and sharing your insights with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Hanis. It's been a pleasure to being here.
All right, and thank you to all our listeners for tuning in to Brace the Race. Remember, we all have a role to play in creating a more inclusive and equitable society. Let's continue this important conversation and work towards a better future for all. Until next time, take care.